All right, hi everyone. We're just waiting for folks to join and we'll get started in a couple minutes. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Frame of Mind webinar. We have two wonderful speakers today that will be talking about climate-related emotions like eco-anxiety and their implications on the well-being and mental health of young people. The climate crisis can stir up a wide range of complex emotions, which I'm sure many of you have felt, and it may be why you're here. I've definitely felt them too. So my name is Serena and I'm Frayme's social media coordinator, and I'll be moderating our Q&A section and introducing our speakers today. If you don't follow us already, make sure to check us out on socials. We're on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and most recently on Instagram. All right. So Frayme is a national knowledge mobilization organization advancing integrated youth mental health and substance use practices in Canada. We're a system intermediary, which, as you may know, has the goal of supporting the provision of services rather than providing direct services itself. We host a network of over 400 partner organizations, including clinicians, researchers, policymakers, and service providers, with the goal of facilitating collaboration and knowledge sharing among organizations working towards system transformation. So, how do we actually help with knowledge sharing? Well, we facilitate KMB activities in a variety of ways, including our annual Learning Institute. We run grant programs, we collaborate on projects with network members, offer a knowledge exchange service, support youth, caregivers, and mental health advocates through Groundbreakers, our network of lived experts to inform the sector. And as you know, we host webinars, amplify lived experiences in our blog and our podcast. In November, we're holding our Lived Expertise Knowledge Series, which is a 2-day virtual event to bring together stakeholders from across Canada to share insights, identify opportunities, and brainstorm solutions that embed lived expertise to demonstrate that the adage, "nothing for us without us," is the ultimate optimizer for youth mental health and substance use system. We recommend you sign up for our newsletter because more information about this is coming up tomorrow. So it's our mission to bring folks across our network together to connect and engage across the sector. We'd love for you and your organization to be a part of this and hope you'll join our network to get access and be the first to know about all these knowledge sharing activities and opportunities. Before we start, be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A or the chat box. We'll be answering them at the end. And feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, but make sure the recipient is set to everyone. We'll be sending you a recording of the webinar tomorrow and ask that you also please fill out the webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what we can do better next time. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to acknowledge that in our office is located in Ottawa, and it is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. Let us all take a moment to think about what traditional territory we currently reside on and what our relationship is to that land. If you're not sure, you can visit native-land.com or scan the QR code at the bottom right corner to put in your location. So it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce today's speakers. Nat is an experienced registered nurse whose clinical expertise is in mental health and public health. She recently completed a double master's degree in nursing and public health at UBC. Some of the projects Nat is involved with include her work as the co-founder of Stars in a Jar and the Coalition of African, Caribbean, and Black Nurses in British Columbia. She's also a filmmaker. So, for example, her film Just a Nurse won an international film campaign and was later translated into Spanish by the General Council of Spain and screened at Lucasfilm Studios. Laura is a truth seeker, community builder, cultural critic, and grief worker. She studied environmental studies, biology, and religious studies, and did her master's in environmental humanities. She's been studying and cultivating personal and collective resilience strategies for nearly a decade, and recently earned an integrative somatic trauma therapy certificate through the Embody Lab. And so without any more delay, I'll hand it off to Nat to get started.
Okay, sorry about that. You'd think 2 years into the pandemic, I wouldn't be doing the muted thing, but anyway, thank you so much, Sharita, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. I'm really excited that we are having such a high turnout and that people are really interested in the topic of climate change and mental health. And so before we get into our webinar, we thought, to make this a little bit interactive and sort of take a pulse of the people that are joining us today. Some of you might have seen this before. It's called the Wheel of Emotions. So just enter in the chat in response to this question. When you think of the words climate change, how does that make you feel? And feel free to use multiple emotions as well. You don't have to just stick to the one.
A lot of answers coming in. See defenseless, overwhelmed, anxious,
Scared,
helpless,
worried,
fearful,
deeply concerned. I also feel that way.
inadequate, powerless, insecure, furious. All right. Well, thank you for putting that in the chat. You're in good company. Can you go to the next slide, please? All right. We very much think that our journey is important to how we got here. And I too feel a lot of those same feelings that were echoed in the chat. I grew up in a family of origin that had a lot of tumult in it, and ended up, as my intro said, eventually earning degrees in biology, environmental studies, religion, and environmental humanities. I was a climate activist and regularly overwhelmed by what I was learning in my classrooms, regularly overwhelmed by the state of the world. It was really a difficult truth to sit with by myself. I felt really isolated and alone and desperate to talk about it. And what I realized is that if I was going to be an activist, I had to address these feelings, some of which were echoed in the chat. I realized that I needed tools to help sustain myself as a change maker, especially because I live with depression and anxiety. So I already am predisposed to feeling a lot of these overwhelming feelings. I ended up co-creating the Good Grief Network, which is a nonprofit organization that brings people together to have really tough conversations about the state of the world. And it helps us arrive at meaningful action. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. But Nat, it's up to you. Tell us about your journey.
Sure. Tamir, if you could go to the next slide. I guess for me, I'm going to echo some of the things that Laura was saying. I guess my story around my own climate change anxiety is something I think is really hard to separate from when you think about all the social identities I occupy in my life. I feel like my whole life I've sort of felt emotionally lost and trapped by the socio-political systems that have hurt me in very deep ways. And I think as someone who occupies just some of the identities, not all of them, right? Being like a nurse, an immigrant, a millennial, being Black, being female, I often felt, growing up, and I still feel like I inherited systems that don't make a lot of sense or seem downright fair or cruel, and not really based on this overall sense of compassion. And I think overall in my journey up to this point, I think I've been reluctant to be open around my concerns around climate change, because growing up, another big thing was that I heard a lot of rhetoric and things being said around, oh, it's like a white person thing. It's like typically things like, oh, it's like, a white person who wears tie-dye and who is vegan and ties themselves to trees. And so I never really saw people who looked like me having discussions around these things. And I'm being very frank in saying this and very vulnerable in saying this. And I was pretty secretive, I guess, around my concerns, because I just didn't feel like there was a place for me to speak about these things, but just other things that I was seeing in the world, whether it's, for example, racism or sexism and so on and so forth. So Tamir, if you go to the next slide. I think the thread that kind of links both Laura's journey and my journey is really what we're speaking to. And one of the reasons why we feel so much about the planet is that the same hurt that I feel every day living in systems that don't support me or people who look like me or marginalized people are the same systems that are causing the climate crisis. So really all the social injustices that we're seeing and the increasing polarization that we're seeing in today's world are interconnected. So it's really difficult to talk about mental health and climate change if we're also not going to be talking about things like income inequality or environmental racism, for example.
All right. And so we know that a lot of things are working against us and are working against life supporting systems. We can see this in the climate crisis itself. This is a direct quote from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is comprised of 195 members with thousands of people worldwide contributing to their reports. Basically, what they provide is a comprehensive summary of what's known about the drivers of climate change, its impacts and future risks, and how adaptation and mitigation can reduce those risks. So the quote that I pulled from here, because I think it directly applies to the interconnection of these crises, is that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society. And it's what Nat was just saying a moment ago. We already know that. And for many of us, we really feel that. There's a lot of things that aren't working for us and aren't life supporting. So if we know that the crises are interconnected and that climate is a symptom of a much bigger problem, then rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society seems like it might be an opportunity. Next slide. So we want to invite you to hold the paradox of the moment that we're in while we see a lot of losses and we have a lot of those heavy and painful feelings. And yet maybe let's try to move towards seeing this change as an opportunity, because we know and we feel that so many things need to change. Because of our psychology, we usually view change as a bad thing or as a threat. But what if we saw it as an opportunity to actually transition away from business as usual and as an opportunity to create truly just and life-supporting ways of being? What if we could start opening our imagination and start dreaming, start moving towards creating a livable future for all people and biodiversity? What might that look like? Let's just hold this throughout the duration of our talk. Next slide. We know that particularly young people are suffering right now. We know that we need to help them. We need to help them see this moment through. A recent study put out by Lancet Planetary Health in December of 2021 surveyed 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25 in 10 different countries across the world. And two statistics we wanted to pull out for you. One is that 75% of young people said that they think the future is frightening. 83% said that they think people have failed to take care of the planet. I'd like for you to read those statistics again and pause with the magnitude of these numbers. We have a lot of work to do in supporting our young people. Next slide.
Echo some of the things, Laura was saying. Studies have shown that youth do have more empathy for the environment and often experience negative emotions when there's a lack of moral clarity regarding climate change. I think what's also important to recognize, especially from a health equity perspective, is that it's likely that the mental health impacts of climate change will disproportionately affect groups who experience marginalization due to intersecting social determinants of health. So for example, youth who are homeless or those who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And especially these groups are more likely to be affected also by other determinants like poor mental health care infrastructure, or a lack of culturally safe care, or even a lack of awareness amongst practitioners around things like how eco-anxiety presents and manifests itself. Next slide. So over the past few years, I was heavily involved in this course at the University of British Columbia called The Health Impacts of Climate Change. And every year I would lead a lecture on mental health and climate change. And I noticed that a lot of the students in the class would be like, thanks for painting this dystopian nightmare for us. Like, what are we supposed to do with this information? And so I got this idea to create a film and toolkit that really was meant to empower you. And one thing I also want to just mention actually is the stuff that I was seeing in the research literature was very much reflected in my everyday life. So, studies have shown, again, like youth between the ages of 10 to 26 endure higher levels of stress and are more likely to report mental health concerns with respect to climate change compared to older generations. And this is further exacerbated by youth who enroll in environmental classes or environmental health classes like the one I was helping with, and have consistently reported increased levels of stress because they have heightened awareness around planetary health. So the way this film and toolkit is meant to work is that youth are watch the film. It's 30 minutes long. It goes over these earth emotions that we're also going to talk about today, which is eco-anxiety, ecological grief, and eco-paralysis. And then following watching the film, then they work through this toolkit that has reflective exercises that they can work through. Next slide. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of, what's eco-anxiety and why is this so important, I think it's good to take a little bit of a more macro level and provide an overview of mental health and climate change more broadly. So one thing that I find so fascinating is like whether it's explicitly acknowledged or unconsciously ignored, the fact of the matter is all humanity, and including everyone in this webinar, myself, Laura, we all actually share a diagnosis of climate change. And I think a growing number of people are able to recognize the relationship between anthropogenic activity and climate change. So, things like the loss of biodiversity. But research studies have suggested that there are gaps in knowledge and behavior related to people understanding the relationship between climate change and health. And this is particularly pronounced with regards to mental health. So I'm always an advocate for a greater understanding and promotion of this concept of planetary health and how really our health and the planet's health go hand in hand. One thing that's also important to talk about also is that evidence suggests that there also will be an increase in a number of other psychiatric disorders, not just eco-anxiety and ecological grief. So things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, psychotic disorders, and suicide are more likely to increase as the climate crisis exacerbates. Lastly, one thing I wanted to talk about is that, climate change affects physical, mental health, and community health, both in direct and indirect ways, but also through a bi-directional relationship. So in simplistic terms, direct effects are seen immediately and tangibly following natural disasters. So think of things like wildfires or, heat waves, or for example, the floods that are currently happening in Pakistan. Whereas, and as a result, you might see, for example, people having higher levels of PTSD in those situations. Whereas on the other hand, indirect effects, which is really what we're talking about in this webinar, are kind of more nuanced. And I kind of think of them as like the slow burn that's in the background that sort of arise from changes in a way that kind of creep up on you. And so examples of indirect effects are sort of forced migration because of changes in socio-political and economic infrastructures that lead to, again, different mental health impacts following that. So recently, since the early 2000s, there have been a growing interest in terms like eco-anxiety, eco-paralysis, and ecological grief. And it's important to recognize that these are actually not mental illnesses that are recognized by the DSM-5. So you're not necessarily going to have a psychiatrist give that diagnosis, but instead, these syndromes are kind of conceptualized within the field of planetary health as potential precursors for mental illness, but really they're referring to the relationship between one's psyche and the environment. And there's a professor, his name is Dr. Glenn Albrecht. He's been seminal in this work, and he says that these syndromes are really a condition of existence and emotion, and not a lesion in the brain. We'll go to the next slide. So as the webinar alluded to, we're going to be talking a little bit about eco-anxiety. And just to make it interesting, I'm curious, we have a poll that we're going to launch. And the poll is rated on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the, the highest and 1 being the lowest. I don't know if everyone can see it. If it's on. There you go. So these are all the statements. I'll just read them out loud and we'll give you a few minutes for you guys to go through. So the statements are, I feel guilty if I waste energy. I'm scared for the future of our planet. I don't know how to prepare children or youth for the future of our planet. I fear that new diseases from climate change could threaten me. All right, so I don't know if everyone can see what I see on my screen, but I'll just kind of look at the results here. So for the first statement, I feel guilty if I waste energy. So 57%, the majority of people said 4 out of 5, which is fairly high. The second one here says, I'm scared for the future of our planet. The majority of people said 5 out of 5. For the third statement, I don't know how to prepare the children, youth for the future of our planet. Again, the majority are 5 out of 5. I fear that new diseases from climate change could threaten me. This is interesting. It's a little bit split between 3 out of 5 and 4 out of 5. So, just by taking this poll, I think that speaks volumes to sort of this distress that everyone is sort of feeling in this room. And going back to that whole thing I was saying before, like everybody shares this diagnosis of climate change. And in some ways, you know, I feel sad seeing that this is how everyone is feeling, but in other ways, I'm feeling hopeful that by talking about this, we can all find ways to address it. So going to the next slide. So eco-anxiety, right? It's basically what everything this poll was alluding to and what everyone on some level in this webinar is feeling. It's conceptualized as the general worry people feel when considering uncertainty of humanity's future with respect to climate change. So I'll give you an example. I remember I did a lecture and a student came up to me and she said, is it morally wrong for me to have children? And imagine me, like someone who doesn't have kids, you know, like in her 20s, having another person, an 18-year-old asking me these questions. And it's, you know, this is an example of what eco-anxiety can look like. And obviously at the time, I really didn't know how to speak to that. And I just kind of, you know, tried to help her the best I could. But, you know, this is also reflected in research, right? The Yale program on climate change communication, this was 2 years ago. They said 72% of Americans believe that climate change will harm future generations, but 41% of respondents felt helpless about it. And so what does eco-anxiety actually look like? It's some of the things we mentioned in the poll, but it's, you know, for example, feelings of failure of not living up to the ideal environmentally conscious person. So I know for me, for example, like if I forget, you know, my reusable cloth bag and I'm going to a grocery store, that always triggers alarm in me. Even though it's a little behavior, it's always like this feeling of I have to do as much as I can because the world is on fire. And so throughout the webinar, we're going to show little clips from the film, the documentary I made. And so we'll listen to Emily's story of eco-anxiety. I can't hear it. Can everyone else hear it?
Really big city in China. And
Is that better?
Yeah, I can hear it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to go back.
being integrated environmental health. So for a large part of my life, I grew up in a really big city in China. And I remember there being a lot of air pollution where I lived. So basically, whenever you looked into the horizon, there was a lot of smog. On a winter day, there'd be so much haze in the sky, and you could barely see, like when I was living in an apartment, I could barely see the apartment next door. So when my family immigrated to Canada, I was so surprised and so shocked at how incredibly clear the skies were and how little smog there was on the horizons. And you could really see far away the mountains, the snow caps of the mountains. Recently, when there are forest fires in the summer, and you see like fires coming in with smoke from interior BC or from California, and the skies would be hazy again. And it would just be kind of scary, and I feel a little bit anxious about it. When I think back to that and how much air pollution I was constantly being exposed to, it just shocks me how much one's environment can have, like how much impact one's environment can have on their health. Do you know what's really
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was actually surprised that Emily brought that up when we were filming her, because the wildfires was causing so much distress. It was a huge topic amongst youth at UBC and just causing so much concern. So we'll go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about ecological, we'll talk a little bit about ecological grief. So one of the things that I want to highlight is that a lot of these emotions are actually natural responses, and ecological grief being one of them. It's a natural response individuals have in reaction to environmental loss and altered landscapes which provide meaning. And there are various types of ecological grief that go just beyond, you know, bereaving related changes to the natural environment. For example, one type of environmental grief involves the loss of environmental knowledge, and this is tied to other social determinants of health like cultural identity. Go to the next slide. So to contextualize this, for example, what ecological grief looks like, let's say in Canada, climate change has destabilized, the housing foundations of, for example, Inuit communities in the Arctic. And this has actually impaired their ability to partake in transportation or hunt or for food sources. And with this sort of loss of being able to do land-based activities, there has been an increase in ecological grief, as well as a number of other mental health concerns as well. And, when you consider other determinants of health that are in the mix, right? So for example, the lack of access to equitable and culturally appropriate resources or mental health infrastructure, some of the negative consequences as a result of this is actually an erosion of personal and communal sense of identity and feeling a lack of control. And so we'll listen to Lauren's clip of ecological grief.
Early August feeling of peace and safety and contentment that we would always have there. I'm Lauren, and I just finished studying kinesiology at UBC. A personal example of eco-grief within my community is the changes within the natural environment, such as the forest that I used to walk around in. Prior to going to university, I just spent a lot of time here to de-stress and relax. I like that the nature really calms me down. However, now coming back to university, all this land has been changed into housing development, and it's really just that deep. I think power is definitely relevant to one's mental health, just because when we feel like we have a lot of power, we perceive that we have a lot of control over the situation, and that's why it's so relevant when we bring up our ability to respond to the climate crisis. It's just because I feel like a lot of people don't believe that we have the ability and control to make a difference. But I think educators need to really promote that we do actually can make differences in these micro-scale actions such as composting.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about eco-paralysis. So eco-paralysis is the response people give when they're faced by this feeling that they can't do anything meaningful to positively affect climate change. And it's commonly linked to feelings of powerlessness, which can be mistaken as a form of apathy, complacency, or disengagement. So let's go to the next slide. So examples of what eco-paralysis looks like is when people do not partake in pro-social behaviors, such as, let's say, reducing electric consumption because they don't see the value of this behavioral change. Or they might wait, for example, to purchase items that might be better for the environment, but only once they're discounted or cheaper. Another example is I'll often hear people they'll be like, oh, I will shop for this, fast fashion brand from abroad that's really bad for the environment because honestly, nothing's changing, nothing's happening. Why should I even bother? And I think eco-paralysis really points to, one's inability to respond meaningfully to sort of the implications of what we have to do in terms of radically changing the systems that are currently, in place in the world. And so we'll end off this part with listening to Maghalie's story of eco-paralysis.
My name is Maghalie. I'm studying kinesiology at UBC. I absolutely find it difficult to manage my personal behaviors and the interests of the planet in sustainable actions. I struggle a lot with even the impacts of the way that I eat. I wonder, okay, if I'm going to go vegan, does that even impact the future of the planet? For me personally, I feel anxiety or nervousness or at least discomfort or anger around the kind of selfishness that exists at institutional levels that lets human beings and other living things on this earth suffer. That causes me a kind of pain, and I know that a lot of people in my age bracket also feel know that that has been created in part by, well, the infrastructure has been created by the people that have come before us. And then we feel like we're left with this, mess and then no way to fix it. So it kind of plays into this sense of this belief as a young person, as an educated person at a university, you have a responsibility to help this earth and help the living things on it and to prevent suffering. But then you're also faced with a society that benefits individual success and individual personal profit gain, or whether that be any kind of gain, whether that be monetary or social. You're kind of faced with this weird mix of you need to do everything to help others, you need to do everything to protect yourself, and you need to make sure that you get ahead and that everybody else around you gets ahead. But how can you get ahead if the entire earth is going backwards and is, not?
So I'll let Laura take the lead now, and she'll frame this a little bit more in terms of eco-distress on the next slide.
All right, thank you, Nat. Those were some really powerful examples of ways that these feelings can manifest in young folks. Eco-distress is a term that many researchers and theorists are incorporating to encapsulate a variety of feelings. The ones that Nat was talking about, things like grief and anxiety and paralysis, fear and hopelessness and anger, we can use to discuss, use eco-distress to discuss. So these feelings can differ depending on our social situations, our age, our culture, our geographic location. Context really matters depending on what we feel. And in her book, Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis, Britt Ray, author and researcher, said that eco-distress needs to rise to the surface and be met head on for transformative work to begin. We feel these heavy and painful things because we're connected, because we're alive. And the challenge of this time is not to deaden to these feelings, not to numb out, not to ignore or distract. We can use the anxiety, the grief, the dread, the fear as a catalyst for change. And this is your reminder that change is an opportunity to press the reset button on the systems of oppression and exploitation that prioritize money over life and life supporting systems. So next slide, please. Before we can get to dreaming up that future that is truly just and truly focused on life, we have to create room to process the heavy and painful feelings and to create space for our imagination. And that's where regulating our nervous systems comes into play. This information is important for us as adults, but also important to teach young people about and informing them and building their emotional intelligence. As Nat said, everyone has the diagnosis of the climate crisis, and so it's important that we're all doing this work. So when we feel these heavy and painful feelings, they tend to bounce us out of our window of tolerance, which is that center of the image up there. The window of tolerance is the zone of optimal functioning for our body and our mind. It's where we're calm, we're regulated, we're able to connect. It's also the state that we can access rational thought and our imaginations. Being overwhelmed day after day by the onslaught of the climate crisis can lead us to a state of hyperarousal, which is typically our fight or flight responses. And so that's when we move up the diagram that's here for us. So some of the physical symptoms are rapid heartbeat, racing thoughts, anxiety-like symptoms. Our adrenaline is pumping at this point. We also can get irritable or angry or restless. So to get out of the state, to get back into our window of tolerance, we can shake out our bodies, we can practice yoga or other types of body movement, or use breathing exercises. But if we don't downregulate, if we don't get back into the window of tolerance and move some of that energy, we can get stuck in a state of hypoarousal, which is the bottom portion of that image. This is the freeze response. So it's where we can shut down, where we can get lethargic, withdrawn. We often experience digestion issues here because our body is focused on shutting down and freezing. And we see most people in a collapsed posture. Prolonged time in the state can lead to depression. So to upregulate, we can practice mindfulness or meditation. We can talk about our heavy and painful feelings with a trusted person, animal, or plant, and do body movement, as I suggested, with the hyperarousal. So practicing some of these regulation techniques that I spoke about can help us widen our window of tolerance, allowing us to build our distress intolerance, which is our ability to be with discomfort, things like heavy and painful feelings that we've been talking about here today. And it's important to note that those of us coming to this work, those of us alive in this time and place with a trauma history or have experienced marginalization and deeply impacted by systems of oppression, we have narrower windows of tolerance. And this is important for how we relate to each other. It's also a whole nother discussion that needs to be had. But the idea here is, next slide, please, is that we're living in a time of a lot of chaos, a lot of information, a lot of things grabbing for our attention. So how we can practice staying in our window of tolerance is to use this method called titration. And titration is a term taken from chemistry, where little by little we add amounts of solution to another solution until an equivalence point is reached. This technique is particularly helpful when encountering our overwhelming feelings. So we can lean into them just a little bit, let a little bit of them in, process them a little bit at a time, and then we come back to our resources. We come back to the people, the places, the things that help us return to a level of okayness and help us get back into that window of tolerance. Then we can look at the painful stuff again, a little at a time. And then again, we return to our window of tolerance. So this is also a good technique for digesting news or our social media feeds. How many of us are guilty of doom scrolling or reading the next article, the next report? Maybe try this titration technique the next time that you're online and limit it a little bit and then come back and resource yourself and then engage again. Next slide. All right, so that's the first step of dreaming up new futures for us and helping us heal. This is what we try to do at Good Grief Network. It's why I created the Good Grief Network, where our mission is to gather in community, process the painful feelings and realities of our time, and commit to meaningful action. Next slide. We're most widely known for our 10 steps to personal resilience and empowerment in a chaotic climate. And this is where we meet together for 10 weeks with people all over the world. We reduce our feelings of isolation. We talk about our grief, our anger, our fears, the things that most of us don't have a lot of space in our normal daily lives to talk about. We practice and teach self-responsiveness, which is boundaried self-care. We learn to take care of ourselves, start to notice our triggers, start to notice when we've exited our window of tolerance. And we build trust by reconnecting and practicing deep listening and really getting to know one another at a heart level. We build community by coming together, sharing ideas and knowledge, and caring for one another. And finally, we start to imagine what new and ancient ways of being might look like. We try to create some space for what the future might look like. Next slide. We are in the process of creating and about to pilot a program specifically for youth. We call it GGNZ. This program was developed by two Good Grief Network alumni, Annalisa Galgano, sorry Annalisa Galgano, and Susan Egris. And basically what we've done here is we've distilled the 10-step program into 5 weeks with the goals of having young people lead each other with the supervision of a trusted adult. The goal is to have it be experiential and connective, so hands-on activities where youth can learn to practice tools, reduce feelings of isolation, and build emotional intelligence. We can also help them identify their resources, those people, those places, those things that help them return to their window of tolerance. We're piloting this program this fall. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Our first step of this program, the first week of the 5 weeks, is to feel our feelings. So we use the feelings wheel that Nat introduced us to at the beginning of the program today. And we help them articulate what it is they're feeling. And we normalize that people can be feeling multiple things at the same time. We can feel joy and grief at the same time. We can feel fear and hope at the same time. Next slide. The next step is that we give them tools for how to be with uncertainty. Like I said earlier, when we're confronted with change, we often view it as a negative or as a threat to our survival. But by building our distress intolerance and cultivating nimbleness, we're able to move with the changing world. Next slide. The third week is doing inner work. And this is where we start to do the inner healing that so many of us need to do. We start looking inward, and then we expand our window of tolerance and then reconnect to ourselves and to others. Next. The fourth week is an invitation to look at the stories we tell ourselves and the stories that our culture tells us. And I think the youth are already doing this, which is why they feel so much betrayal for the older populations, is they already notice that our social norms and our social biases aren't focusing on life. They're actually stealing from our future, which is a huge injustice. And so we want to create space to look more at our personal biases, more at our cultural biases, and just start breaking them apart so that something new can be planted and grown. Next, the fifth slide, or the fifth step is an opportunity to reclaim our personal agency, to help each young person figure out where we can effectively impact change on the community and personal levels. So this is the program that we're about to pilot and that we're working specifically for youth. Next slide. But we don't have to wait for a program to get started. I think Nat and I can invite you right now to start getting started on doing several things that will help you calm your nervous system. The first thing is that I'm going to repeat again that we have a focus on youth, but until we as adults start looking at the things that scare us and cause us fear, we're not going to be able to sit with the youth through their fear and through their anger and through their heavy feelings. So it's essential that we start talking about the climate crisis and other overlapping issues. We have to be willing to face them, which means processing those feelings. If we can't be with our feelings about the state of the world, we're limited in our capacity to be with the feelings and the overwhelm of young people. We can also get educated about the interconnectedness of social injustice, wealth disparities, sexism, ableism, and how they're all symptoms of much larger systemic issues that also cause the climate crisis. We can do our feelings work and our own inner work of healing past traumas and learning to expand our window of tolerance. And we too must become more nimble and learn how to be with uncertainty. We've had a huge invitation with the pandemic, but we must learn how to go with the flow and open our imaginations up. And when we look for openings, we can find opportunities to create or to act. And this helps if we're in our window of tolerance. Additionally, we can all learn to practice gratitude and experience joy and teach young folks how to do that as well. We can start noticing what's still here and celebrate that. We can find moments of awe and beauty to help sustain us through the hard times. And this is helped by reconnecting with the more than human world. Mindfulness and meditation can also help us return to the present moment. And studies have shown that it helps increase our capacity for compassion. It also stops the racing thoughts and the anxiety over the future worlds. And finally, we have to connect. Business as usual operates by fragmenting. We are fragmented from ourselves and our feelings. We're fragmented from other people, and we're fragmented from the more than human world that still gives to us as she's hurt. We are being asked to connect in these very distressing times. Nat, back to you.
So we'll go to the next slide. So what can you do for youth right now? I think some of the things that Laura was saying about being critical about sort of the collective narratives or the narratives we've been told, I think many youth, particularly Gen Z, millennials, have demonstrated, a critical, I would say, global perspective on climate change. And that's why I think they're more likely than older generations to have mental concerns related to it. And I think at the heart of it, like climate change related emotions revolve around questions of power, because they relate to other issues like autonomy, marginalization, and disempowerment. And so, I think it's in order to address the mental well-being of youth, it's really important to discuss how they see themselves fitting into climate change discussions and the world at large. And I think by questioning their own sense of power, this can help youth gain better self-awareness and potentially enable behavior change. And specifically, it can get them to think more critically about the existing structural inequities that exist in the world and challenge the assumption that they don't actually have the capacity to overcome, the systems of oppression actually that they have inherited. One other thing I wanted to point out is, within, climate change communication research, studies have shown that in order to raise awareness or talk about issues, it's really important to employ communication strategies that incorporate people's experiences rather than fear mongering, which leads to disengagement. And really, hard facts, like everyone knows that climate change is happening, right? And the question is, why hasn't there been the catch-up piece to, or a response, a meaningful response to it? And I think, yeah, it goes back to the fact that hard facts are not what motivate change. It's really values, right? Values. What are your personal values? What are the collective values, right? And so in reflecting about your personal values, seeing how you fit in the world, do you have power? All of these things, ways to actually mobilize all of this is really by creating a space for young people to talk about what's bothering them. I think kind of tying this back to my story at the beginning, right? Like, as someone who identifies as like a Black female, all these things, like I never felt like there was a space for me, like ever in these discussions. And actually, it's when I started noticing that there were organizations, like there's one organization called Color the Trails, where it's like, BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, women who go on these nature walks. And it's like seeing things like that made me feel more safe, right? To talk about these things with people that I knew. So creating that space for people to talk is really important. I also think, going back to what Laura was saying about, finding what helps you regulate, right? Grounding practices. For me, for example, I'm really into meditation. I know not everyone's into meditation, but it's really helped me. Having a consistent practice has been very helpful for me. And I know that there are other clinicians here, I'm sure, on the webinar that have used different grounding strategies for their clients. The other thing too is also when we frame discussions around climate change, so much of it is around what we're losing, and just and it's sad, right? Like it's like there's this grief around, like, look at the state of the world, it's no longer going to be the way it is. And I think redirecting that, or reframing that, cognitively reframing that to noticing what's still here, right? Like noticing the trees that are still around your neighborhood and all the life that's still around us, because there's still so much to enjoy and appreciate and have gratitude for. And then the last piece, I think, is just speaking to what Laura was saying around connection. Like, in order to help our own emotions, we need to connect with one another, but also that's how we're going to, I hate to use the word radical, but have these sort of radical acts of compassion amongst each other, and hopefully that would bleed into system change. And so I'll leave it back to Laura to go to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the most important recommendations we have for how to help youth is to get connected yourself and to connect youth. Here are some lists. This is not a full comprehensive list by any means, but these groups are creating connections and creating community groups to face the hard time that we're in. I do want to highlight Force of Nature, which is a UK-based group that focuses on youth, and it's led by youth. We will have a one-page handout that we will add to the webinar, and so it has the websites of all of these groups, so you can look around and see if there's one that fits you over others. Next slide. All right, that's it, and we thank you, and we're available to take any questions you might have.
All right, thank you both so much for taking us through your work and for sharing so many valuable insights and strategies on how we can support young people. These emotions are challenging, they're difficult to navigate, but this conversation gives me hope that through community, through support and understanding, we can learn how to manage them and take action together. So we've had a lot of good questions coming in from our attendees. So let's move right into our Q&A. Our first question for both of you is, can you speak more about the intention behind the language you used in today's webinar? Why did you both choose to describe and acknowledge very specific emotions rather than lumping them into one category like negative emotions? And why is it good to do so in conversation with others, especially youth?
Laura, do you want to take that, or should I?
I think the first part definitely goes to you for your toolkit project.
Well, I think, the biggest piece in doing emotional work or regulating your emotions is to identify what you're actually feeling. And I think by naming the emotion is the first thing you do in like emotional awareness work. I don't think that also, I think I'll just say one more thing. Like a lot of this stuff that we're focusing on, these they're actually called psychoterapeutic syndromes or earth emotions. And these are actually sort of neologisms that are emerging from the research literature. So there's actually research studies to suggest that these emotions are a little bit more nuanced than just saying, oh, I feel sad, mad, happy. I forget what the other one is, but so I think by naming the emotion, then people can really make the connection between what they're feeling. And once they know what they're actually feeling, then that creates the accompanying behavior change. I don't know if that made sense. If you want me to elaborate more, I can. Or Laura, if you want to add something more to that.
I just want to add a plug or a request that we, as people working with youth, move away from calling any sort of feelings or emotions negative. I know that this is what we do as practitioners, or this is what practitioners do. But I think that our view of emotions as negative keeps us from facing them, keeps us from processing them. All emotions are data points, they're information. And if we can see them as such, then maybe we can actually change the norm around our resistance to be with the ones that are uncomfortable or painful.
And then I just had a thought, like another thing, one of the pros of naming these emotions is that it shows the connection between your mental health and the environment, but also it gets people to talk about climate change. Because I think right now, like eco-anxiety in particular, I think is very popular. Some of these other psychoterapeutic syndromes are not as much. And I think it's one of those things to get, it's kind of like a good tool also for activists, right, who are trying to find ways to connect with people on what they're actually feeling, because it's a little bit less sexy to be like, oh, like we're sad, like the world's on fire, versus saying, let's name this what this actually is. We're feeling anxious because of what's going on with our environment.
Great, thank you both for that response. So the next question is, climate change is obviously a global issue, but coming from a Canadian perspective, many Indigenous cultures tie the health of the earth to one's own health, as well as one's spirituality and cultural connectivity. Where and how do you think there is room to acknowledge and embrace Indigenous ways of knowing and take a two-eyed seeing approach to address climate change's effects on one's mental health in our Indigenous populations, but as well as our general public? And that's the response. So whoever wants to jump in first can go ahead.
Sorry, is there a place where all the questions, like I don't see where the questions are?
They are in the Q&A.
I can just add that or start by, I think this is a really rich question and a really important question. The first thing that I want to say is I think most of our troubles come from when we tried to separate our own health from the health of the planet. And I think that so long as we don't take from Indigenous knowledge without, like, appropriation is huge right now because we've taken so much without giving back. And I think that Indigenous leaders have a lot of wisdom that has not been heard. It's a lot of wisdom about how to protect lands, how to keep lands safe, what biodiversity means, and how not just to remove oneself from the land, but to have an intimate relationship with the land and be supportive of it. And so I think it's really important that Indigenous voices come here and we can acknowledge the privilege that I come with being a speaker on this panel. You know, we can create more spaces for people who have Indigenous backgrounds, who have different worldviews. I think a lot of the wisdom that is being held is held in the margins, and so we can uplift them as best as we can.
I don't really have anything to add. I think Laura's response is really bang on. I know that from a health promotion piece, like, again, it's the wickedness of climate change and mental health in general, right? It's tied to so many other things. It's not, climate change is not just like, it's a symptom of something larger, right? And when you think about how Indigenous communities have been treated, the impact of colonialism and all of these things, like, I think, you know, having health promotion programming or just infrastructure to enable people to actually get together and do land-based activities, or like you were saying, incorporating approach to addressing climate change is really important. But I also just think, like Laura was saying, recognizing that I don't feel like I can speak to this in terms of the general public, but I know that there have been things, initiatives by Indigenous communities to really, within their own community, to address this very issue. And I think it's very important.
Thank you both. So our next question is, Canada is the 10th highest global emitter, but our share of greenhouse gases did decline to 1.5% in 2019 from 1.8% in 2005. Given our relatively small share and incremental progress versus countries like China and the United States, how do we position or understand both of our local contributions to reversing climate change versus the need for other countries to step up and change?
So I'll just paraphrase that my understanding of that, because I don't have it in the chat, but basically just asking what's Canada's role when other countries may not be pulling their weight. Is that kind of the gist of the question?
Yes, I believe so.
You know, I don't know if I can actually speak to this because I am not actually like a politician. So, you know, I can speak more on like sort of the health piece of that. But I don't know, maybe if that person who asked that question, they could just sort of elaborate a little bit more, like, what do you mean by position? Do you mean yourself as an individual? Do you mean like, maybe if that person can speak a little bit more. I don't know, Laura, if you have something you want to add to this.
I have a theoretical approach to this, but yeah, I'm open to seeing if the question asker wants to elaborate a little bit more, or I can go into my theoretical.
Okay, let's hear your theoretical idea.
Well, we absolutely have to divorce money and politics. You know, like we are seeing a lot of corruption happening, and I live in the United States right now, so obviously we're like a huge example of money and politics working together to stop us from cutting emissions. And so I think until we start seeing that, until we have a political movement that really values life and life supporting systems, then that's going to be tough. But I also think that it's important, and much of our emphasis in Good Grief Network is on the individual and the community level. Like basically politicians are always laggards to respond. They're not going to be the ones that are pushing out on culture change and pushing out on any type of change that we need that's for the positive. This is where activist groups, community groups, this is where cohesion matters. This is why we start connecting and see where we can go from there. And so that is my best response, is like, yes, we have to put pressure on politicians. Yes, we have to do those kinds of things, but the power structures are really entrenched and have a lot of vested interest in maintaining business as usual. So we go to where we can have power, and that's in the community level.
And that's why I feel like this question is really, it's very challenging to answer. And I think for me, what I do in my personal life is like, I try my best to join different advocacy groups. So for example, like in the nursing world, there's an organization called the Canadian Association for Nurses for the Environment. Like things like that, I feel is within my locus of control. And, you know, that's how I do my advocacy work. But I don't know, like on a geopolitical level, like, you know, I'm not, you know, actually having conversations with other countries. And so it's very difficult to answer that question. But I agree with Laura, like living in a capitalist society, like it's not very life supporting. And so there are bigger questions around what these new imagined systems should look like. And I hope that answered your question to whoever who answered that, whoever asked that question.
All right, thank you. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. We'll do the one in the chat right now and then end off on one more. So how do we help people take action and reduce their anxiety in the face of these global challenges?
Do you want to go
Okay.
first?
Or you go first, Laura.
Oh, I went first last time, so I can have.
Okay, fine. Well, I think again, it's like just summarizing some of the things that we're talking about, right? Like name the feeling, and once you name the feeling, connecting to sort of like how do you see yourself fitting into, how do you see this feeling fitting into a larger narrative of what's going on in the world? And so like for me, for example, like I value things like compassion, and if I feel, a lot of eco-anxiety, one thing I might do, for example, is volunteer work, right? And so I think it's connecting that emotion, leaving space for that emotion and help regulate that emotion, and then connecting that to something that the person, would like to do. Not everybody is going to be going out and protesting on Parliament Hill, right? But there are ways that can help nourish your soul, and also nourish the soul of the planet. And I don't know, Laura, if you want to add some things, like again, connecting to different community groups like the Good Grief Network is a good idea. I know there's a climate psychology group that I'm very into. They meet on Zoom. Like there's so many different ways to reduce anxiety and find connection with other people that are feeling the same way.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, and Nat pointed to this, but I'll say it a slightly different way, is that we have to be change makers in our own way. Like we have been basically told that we either are attending protests or we're calling our politicians, and that's the only agency we have. But how do we take agency again back to the personal and the collective level? And then one action that we all are being called to do right now is to investigate our norms and the stories we tell ourselves and the ways that we perpetuate the systems of oppression. Because we have been enculturated by this culture, by the Western paradigm, because we've grown up around these norms, we have a duty to investigate how they live through us. And until we're ready to investigate how they live through us, many of us will perpetuate harm without even being aware that we're perpetuating harm. And that is one thing that we're all being asked to do, is this self-investigative work, this self-healing work, healing our traumas so that we can open to our imagination and start moving towards paradigms that are life-centered and life-serving.
Thank you both. So we've got one last question, and I think this is a really great question to end on. So can you elaborate on why it's so important for us to notice what is still here? And can you share maybe a personal example of how you came to know this?
Sure, yeah. I think Nat did a great job in the last part when she was wrapping up and talking about how we often are framing climate change about all the things we're losing. And that's important. It's important to hold that space of grief, and it's important to acknowledge the things that are being lost. But there's also a lot of beauty, a lot of awe, a lot of things to be grateful for that still exist. And I think in our binary way of looking at, well, it's all loss, we can hold both. We can hold what's still here and grieve the losses. And I mean, my example is that I got to meet a redwood tree just last year for the first time, and they're so big and they're so beautiful. And the one that I became friends with, I can actually go inside, and it has burn scars all over it. And I think for me, it was the reminder that this tree has been around for 500 years. I met another one that's been around for 1,000 years, and that it holds a lot of wisdom that I don't have access to. I'm a 30-something millennial. I only have a certain amount of wisdom within me. And so I look to what's still here. I look to deep time. I look to the natural world for inspiration about how to move through these times.
All right, so Tamira, if you could pull up the closing or the ending slide. Okay, perfect. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We've had a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you more online. Reminder that you'll be getting a recording of this webinar in your inbox tomorrow, a link to our post-webinar survey, as well as a link to a one-pager with a lot of helpful resources from Nat and Laura. So as I said, I look forward to connecting with you more through our socials, and we'll hope you'll join our network and subscribe to our newsletter. And thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Natanya and Laura, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone. It was lovely to be hosted, so thank you.
I echo that. Thank you. Oh, thanks, folks.